Hello, everyone. Welcome, members of the press. We are grateful to have you here today. My name is Alex Alt. I serve as a policy counsel for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights here in Washington, D.C., and I'll serve as MC for today's press conference. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, in partnership with the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation, have called this press conference to raise awareness around what many of us within the civil rights community believe will be one of the most critical issues of 2024, artificial intelligence and its profound impact on elections and democracy. As many of you know, Senator Schumer hosted an AI Insight Forum earlier today to discuss and assess how AI systems will impact the American electoral process and our democracy. The advent of AI technology can amplify mis and disinformation and hone its effectiveness, threatening the ability to participate in elections and trust in our democracy. The conversation today in Congress was to highlight what policy solutions exist to address these novel risks. Based on analysis by AI experts and academics, voting advocates, and civil rights and racial justice organizations like the Lawyers Committee and the National Coalition for Black Civic Participation, all evidence shows that AI will pose new risks to our electoral process, especially for Black and Brown communities. We must act now to protect every person's right to shape our democracy. To speak more to these issues, we have two of the nation's foremost civil rights leaders with us here today. Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and Melanie Campbell, President and CEO of the National Coalition Black Civic Participation. Mr. Hewitt has more than 20 years of civil rights litigation and policy experience, including prior leadership roles in the nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors. Formerly, as Executive Vice President at the National Lawyers Committee, he coordinated the nation's strategic, programmatic, and operational efforts to address the fight for racial justice. Please note, after Mr. Hewitt and Ms. Campbell have made their remarks, we will take questions. Damon, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a short while ago, earlier this morning, Melanie Campbell and I participated in one of the AI Insight forums in the Senate. This one focused on elections and democracy. We had the unique opportunity to convene with members of Congress and the Senate, and also well over a dozen other leaders and representatives from the private and public sectors, nonprofits, big tech, and other types of organizations, to discuss AI-related risks to elections, as well as opportunities to democratize policymaking, quote unquote. I want to note that at the onset that when these AI Insight Forums were announced, we at the Lawyers Committee and a host of other organizations called for an open door process instead of what we have, which is frankly a closed door, closed press approach. We believe the public deserves a seat at the table as their representatives in Congress work to develop regulations around AI. That said, we accepted the invitation to ensure that the information and perspectives we have as a racial justice organization were brought to bear in these important discussions. Today's forum was particularly timely and important. Of course, yesterday, and also during the early voting period, people all around the country cast their votes in a number of important local and statewide elections, setting the stage for the 2024 election cycle, which is already showing signs of becoming one of the most contentious and pivotal elections in our nation's history. Both the Lawyers Committee and the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation have significant experience, both with respect to voting and democracy in elections and also AI and tech. As the convener of the Election Protection Coalition, the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection effort, we at the Lawyers Committee play a unique role ensuring that historically disenfranchised communities, specifically Black voters, have a chance to use their votes and have their voices heard to make the promises of our democracy real. The coalition boasts over 300 institutional partners and features a suite of voter access hotlines in multiple languages, including 866 Our Vote. Through our voting rights project at the Lawyers Committee, we've litigated more voting rights cases in the past decade than any other racial justice organization, including the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The Lawyers Committee also has a long history advocating for civil rights protections in the digital realm through our Digital Justice Initiative. We've helped lead the call for a lot of the actions you've been seeing recently. Executive action through the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights from the White House a year ago, the recent executive order on artificial intelligence, and the draft guidance from the Office of Management and Budget. Recently, alongside Senator Cory Booker and other leading advocates, we also convened a briefing on the Hill to discuss the civil rights challenges tied to artificial intelligence and the solutions needed to ensure that these systems and tools are free of bias and used responsibly. Between our work in all of these realms, election protection, voting rights, digital justice, we at the Lawyers Committee monitor and address the intersecting issues of AI, racial justice, and digital privacy. We have fought misinformation, we fought disinformation, and all forms of voter suppression. We can unequivocally say to you today that AI tools pose a threat to our democracy, and they are set to exponentially grow in their negative impact unless there is timely intervention by Congress. One of our recent cases offers a great example. In 2020, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of the National Coalition on Black Civil Participation. Melanie, I think we'll talk about that case a bit later. But just to highlight it, we sued two individuals, Jack Berkman and Jacob Wool. These two orchestrated a disinformation campaign targeted at Black voters. They recorded a robocall filled with false and misleading information and sent it to 85,000 people, targeting Black voters along the way in an attempt to discourage and intimidate them into not voting by mail. Now, we won that lawsuit on summary judgment earlier this year when a federal court found that this conspiracy to violate civil rights and silence Black voters violated both Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act and also the Ku Klux Klan Act. But despite winning that case, the danger is not over. That's because the methods used to develop and distribute those deceptive robocalls back in 2020 are frankly primitive by today's technology standards. If a similar disinformation campaign were waged today, it could be powered by AI, and the perpetrators could do not a clumsy job of targeting Black voters, but they can do so with surgical precision. They can better mimic trusted messengers, like myself and Melanie. They could use a combination of personal data, deepfake videos, and voice cloning to deceive voters more effectively than they did the last time. People, this is a tangible harm, a disaster waiting to happen. We're a year out from this consequential election and a day after yesterday's election, and we have no specific federal legislation to address this issue. But it doesn't have to be that way. In the coming year, the Lawyers Committee, in partnership with other civil rights and advocacy organizations, AI scientists, and other experts, will invest even greater efforts in resourcing and pursuing innovative means to prevent and counter harmful misinformation and disinformation. We fully anticipate generative AI to rapidly advance the pace at which mis and disinformation can materialize and the pace at which biased algorithms and social media can amplify it, all at the expense of Black and brown people and voters. But we can't do this alone. Congress must act now to regulate AI so that technological innovation can empower us instead of harm us. Legislators should create rules and safeguards so that AI development benefits rather than harms our democracy and ensures that the tools are not repurposed to attack our elections and undermine democracy. Establishing clear guidelines and regulations that prohibit algorithmic discrimination and require adequate testing will increase the public's trust in AI and will encourage developers to create tools that enhance rather than harm. Big tech must be accountable. That's accountable on their own volition and also being held accountable to drive and implement these needed changes. We believe corporations have a responsibility to be good corporate citizens and protect our democracy. That means not just having diverse teams developing and troubleshooting products, but also ensuring that AI tools are safe before they're deployed and that the tools are tested even after they're deployed to monitor for potential harms. Keep this in mind. Black and brown communities have been attacked in the real world for hate and violence that is promoted online. Attacks in Buffalo, El Paso, and elsewhere were connected to online message boards and forums. White supremacist content online can be amplified and disguised by AI to reach and motivate the hateful and the disaffected. AI developers and deployers have an obligation to ensure that their products do not hasten a pathway to radicalization. So when you combine the fact that so much of the social media and other platforms were information superhighways for white supremacist ideology and content, with the deep fakes and other mimicking and mimicry that you can see through AI, and you combine that with a precarity, frankly, of of democracy in terms of how elections are protected and how voters are protected, then we're leading to a potential perfect storm. The bottom line is this: to maximize the positive benefits of AI, the public has to first be able to trust that the tools will be used in our best interests. AI regulation and legislation must have specific and strong civil rights protections. And we cannot support legislation that fails to meet this mark, that fails to meet the moment. That's the bottom line. Now, I want to introduce you to my close friend and colleague and sister in this fight and justice, Melanie Campbell. Melanie is the president and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. She's a friend and ally, a client at times in certain cases, and also a mentor in this work. She has served as an advisor to some of our nation's leaders, from U.S. presidents, members of Congress, corporate labor, nonprofit execs, philanthropists, and faith leaders on critical issues impacting Black America. She's dedicated her life and her career to addressing these issues, one of them being civic engagement and leadership and voting in the Black community. She walks in the halls of power, as she did today, this morning, but she's also been on the ground in recent weeks with real people, helping to ensure that Black voters' voices are heard loud and clear. Melanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you for your leadership, your partnership, and you and the Lawyers Committee for being there when we need you. And this is one of those times. So thank you so much. And it has always just been a true pleasure working with you and your dedication to our communities and our nation to make sure that we have the right to protect our voting rights, our rights and freedoms that we hold so dear, and to protect this democracy from peril. I want to echo Damon's sentiments and emphasize how critical it is that we are gathered here to address the profound impact of artificial intelligence on our elections and democracy. As the president and CEO of the National Coalition, as well as the convener of the Black Women's Roundtable, I truly understand the urgency of this conversation and its relevance to the communities we serve. As Damon mentioned just a while ago, I had the privilege participating in Senator Schumer's AI Insight Forum on elections and democracy. I believe it was very timely. As Damon, I wish it could have been more public, but I think it was important that it did happen. And let folks know who are listening that you can see the kind of things that we actually also go to, I think, Senator Schumer's site and get the information that we share in written form, so folks can know what people said and what their recommendations were and concerns were by doing that. Damon mentioned that the Lawyers Committee supported us in the case of NCBCP versus Wall. We filed that lawsuit against defendants alleging they sent 85,000 robocalls to Black Americans in an attempt to scare them from voting, updating Jim Crow era voter suppression tactics. This is what we see that was through those robocalls. And if you think about what's happening, when we talk about suppression, it is AI has the ability for it to run rampant, and we're trying to find a way to catch up to that, because accountability is what's going to be required for that to happen. As outrageous as it had to be to have that lawsuit, as I mentioned, it's an example of ways in which technology can be used negatively to launch insidious and pervasive voter suppression campaigns that undermine our voting system, that ultimately threatens our democracy. That is why Black and Brown people have reason to approach AI within the context of elections and other means with caution and suspicion. In this era of rapid technological advancement, it's clear that AI will play an increasingly significant role in shaping our electoral process. However, it's not just about embracing innovation, it's about safeguarding the integrity of our democracy. Our discussions today revolved around the potential risk that AI poses to our elections, including misinformation, disinformation, and other forms of digital manipulation. These risks are particularly concerning for communities of color who have historically face voter suppression and disenfranchisement. Michigan has taken a proactive stance with its legislative efforts, and we had someone that represented really trying to address these concerns from the bottom up, if you will. It is imperative that lawmakers at both the state and federal levels look at legislation that is already being developed or is pending. A couple of those things that we discussed was the Real Political Ads Act that's sponsored by Representative Yvette Clarke and Senator Klobuchar. This legislation mandates disclaimers on political ads that utilize AI-generated content and represents a significant step, I believe, toward transparency in political messaging. Additionally, bipartisan Protect Elections from Deceptive IA Act is co-sponsored by Senators Klobuchar, Hawley, Coons, and Collins, takes an even more comprehensive approach by seeking to ban deep fakes in federal campaigning that are intended to deceive voters. Some of the recommendations that we made, that I made on behalf of the coalition, was to recommend the establishment of an AI task force on elections and democracy that can be utilized in real time to monitor what is happening in the 2024 election, and so that there's a way to try to address that. We have such agencies that are in place, like the Election Assistance Commission, of course, Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, and any other agencies that would need to be involved. We believe that it's important for there to be requiring a robust government-sponsored study on AI's impact on elections and democracy. Also recommended ensuring companies have a roadmap and incentives for addressing abuses of their technology when they occur while protecting the freedom that defines our society. Lastly, focusing on the government again, ensuring the government has the resources needed to keep up with industry, incentivizing it to consider the potential negative civil and human rights impact on the front end of innovation. And lastly, requiring businesses to provide transparency about how their algorithms operate and how they use personal data, especially as it impacts elections and democracy. And I keep saying elections and democracy. The topic was critical because we cannot allow for technology to ruin this structure that we have. And it's about trust. And if you don't trust it, then guess what? It's only going to erode our problems that we're already having. So thank you, Damon, for partnering with this conversation. Looking forward to hearing from any media that may have questions for us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I'd like to give a brief reminder. If you have questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. And Damon and Melly would be happy to address them.
Definitely. As we're waiting, I just want to flag something that came up. I was just looking back at my notes from the forum, which just wrapped maybe less than 2 hours ago. There was a comment from someone from a conservative think tank who cautioned against regulation. No surprise. That's what we would expect. But this person said, well, there's existing regulation. You have a Voting Rights Act. And I just want to point out the irony and the practicality or lack of therein. The irony is that some of the same people who attacked the Voting Rights Act so viciously, who gutted the pre-clearance provision, the prophylactic provision, the real teeth of it in Section 5, and who has also been going after Section 2 in terms of vote dilution and denial. These are some of the same people who are saying, well, you have a Voting Rights Act. We've been down that road already. The Supreme Court told us we had a Voting Rights Act Section 2 available when they gutted Section 5, and then they went after Section 2 as well. So we're not going for the okie doke on that again. But more importantly, I would say this: those provisions, are really governing state action. When it comes to private action, we did win the case that we filed on behalf of the National Coalition under Section 11B of the Act, which applies to people acting under color of law, state or not, or private as well. So that's important. We won that under that provision, which prevents voter intimidation. But here's the thing: not every court and every circumstance of misinformation or even disinformation would necessarily rise to what that particular court or court of appeals or this U.S. Supreme Court would find is actually intimidation. So we need something specifically to stop mis and disinformation in its tracks. So any notion that we have enough laws already is fallacious. Any notion specifically that the Voting Rights Act itself is enough is fallacious. I think there's still power in the Voting Rights Act. We just need to make sure it is strengthened, but we can't overburden that act, which was written initially in 65, reauthorized in 82, and of course in 2006, and been slowly neutered since then. We can't put the full burden on the Voting Rights Act to address what technology is able to do to undermine democracy. It is part of the solution, but not the only solution.
Damon, one of the other things I did want to add, when we talk about voter suppression and how AI can put it on steroids, I think we can think about, if folks could think about when your image is manipulated. That's not a new thing. So you have a candidate and they may have that Black candidate change their color, make them look menacing, right? So we're talking about the ability for AI to do that on steroids, but also manipulate your image to do all kinds of things. So that reality about how it can actually impact those who are running for office or those who are already in office and trying to run again is a real thing, is a real way of how this stuff can be manipulated, and how companies have to have some accountability, which I mentioned earlier. You have and say the first source is the company, are the companies that are going to put this out, and yes, it's open source, but and then also to make sure that when you're looking at bias and how that can happen, and through who is developing can't talk today, algorithms, right, and things like that. That's why it's important. And I think what I left there cautiously optimistic that something needs to happen. I think where we left was that, at least from the conversation, and a whole lot has to happen. If you already have legislation that's out there, that we need to move swiftly, because the election is here. And if we end up having problems through this AI that we can't even all foresee, we can foresee from historical perspectives what it could do, but also to be able to say this, whatever the worst thing you think could happen, it could be on steroids, especially through technology. And so many people, especially young people, get their information online. And so if they're getting bad information, misinformation, and just quite frankly, outright lies, right, and they're running with that, then that's going to erode trust in this democracy. And if you can't trust it, it will crumble, as imperfect as it may be.
Melanie and Damon, one of the things mentioned in the discussion today was the idea of Congress being incapable of addressing all of the potential harms of AI, but that not being a good enough reason to not do something on this issue. Melanie, you mentioned a couple legislative proposals that your organization supports. Damon, you gave a couple principles talking about what you would hope Congress addresses. But what was your message to lawmakers in the room about how to tackle the magnitude of these issues?
Do something, right? Not doing anything is not an option, because AI is here. It's already manipulated. We've had elections in the past, especially foreign actors, right, who target Black men as an example. That's a real thing that happened, and it's not going to stop. So if you don't have an ability to remove, and you have people who were there who were secretaries of state who ran elections in their state, and I think that was important to have those voices in the room as well, to say they need the help, right? And that the companies have to be responsible enough to put in the resources, the people resources, to make sure that they're pulling down bad information. But if you open it up and you roll back, and that's really what's happening with some of these entities, then all you're opening it up for is for more bad actors to manipulate and put out bad information, and make sure that they impact elections in an adverse way that's not good for our nation.
Definitely. This notion that, well, you can't solve some of the problems unless you solve all of them is kind of a permutation on this notion of too big to fail. It's like it's too much to regulate, or we're too reliant on it, or it's so much for the fabric of what we do and see every day. Those are just excuses, quite honestly, for either those who have interests they want to protect, or for those who just don't have the political will. I did sense some of that will in the room in a positive way. I really did. Of course, we need to multiply that, across the board by many other senators. There was certainly some senators in the room. I can recall, if you noted earlier, Senators Warnock and Booker and Klobuchar and Warner and Padilla and a number of others who were there expressing interest. So it's kind of an odd format, but they're there because they're interested, and some of them have bills of their own, right? They're just not necessarily driving the train for the AI Inside forums. So I agree with Melanie. It's important to do something and make a move. And we're running out of time. As I said earlier, we are a year out from this consequential election. We're a day past local and state consequential elections of yesterday. And I think there's a lot to celebrate as far as Black citizen participation in the elections of yesterday. What I worry about is not yesterday or even today, but tomorrow and the next day and next year. Because every time something horrible doesn't happen, we get the reasons why folks don't want to regulate. This is how we got YouTube allowing election deniers back on the platform. They said essentially privately, well, nothing really horrible happened in the 2022 midterm, so let's let the election deniers back on. Now election deniers powered by AI are free to do their, dirty work on that platform. And that's just a crying shame. And again, let's be clear, not all of the bad activity is because of AI, but AI is a force multiplier. Because as long as we've had elections in this country, we have had racial discrimination in elections and vote suppression, specifically of Black voters. So you use a force multiplier on that, and guess what we're going to get? An undermining of democracy for people who are fighting and scrapping to have their voices heard.
The other thing, David, that was mentioned, and Alex, that I think was important is it's not just about the federal elections. It's about that election right in your local community, that mayor's race, that school board race, that city council race. So the reality is, if you don't have a systemic way of addressing a problem this large, then it's open for all kinds of things that happen that won't make the news, right? But it'll impact folks in their own, on those local races. I think that's important. It was one of the things that was discussed a little more in the conversation that I think we have to also be cognizant of. There's elections every day, every year. And the local elections are some of those things, and people won't have the resources. So the idea that what's needed from the federal government is to help provide those resources to states. That's a nonpartisan, right, reality that needs to happen. So we have those resources for the local boards of elections, the state secretaries of states, or whoever is managing your elections in your state, that they have those kind of resources that are needed to help fight this fight. And it is a fight. It's going to be a fight. And so we're going to do all we can. David, I'm looking forward to working closely with you and our colleagues and others, and really challenging the Senate, and Lord knows we'll see what happens with the House.
Yes.
But we really need to see legislation, but also to work with the providers, right, and to make sure that they do all that they can to mitigate this situation, so we don't have our democracy eroded because of AI.
Indeed.
Melanie and Damon, I think there's a really interesting through line between both of what both of you said, which is kind of where attention's at versus the impact that AI is having. Melanie, you talked about this with a lot of people focused on federal elections, but local elections being particularly primed for disinformation. Damon, you talked about this with how we focus focus on kind of the outputs of AI, but a lot of people don't realize that AI systems are also responsible for your Google searches, right? Or some of the data and the lists of who is targeted and for what. So what did you have to say to lawmakers in the room, or maybe some of the corporate partners who are more focused on just the visible aspects of the AI without wanting to address some of the more privacy or data concerns or smaller scale effects that are undergirding why we care about this issue?
Well, look, it's sometimes the harm is in what you don't see. That's how algorithms work. And sometimes, not all, but some of the companies tell us, well, the algorithm is just a mirror we're holding up to you. These are your preferences. This is data about you. But the truth is, Alex, as you know, when we log on to certain platforms, especially social media, you and I have different feeds. That's not all a function of what you and I want to see or who we are. It's what other people want us to see. It's about what they think we want to see. It's what they think about us. That means in certain public accommodations settings, which we believe social media platforms really should be regulated like public accommodations. It means you're going to see different rental and housing opportunities. You'll see different job opportunities. You'll see different scholarship opportunities. And the harm is about the things you don't see is that you don't know what you don't see, right? And so these things are happening to us. It's like essentially having, to make it a stark example, a whites only and a colored only water fountain signs. Deep South, segregation of yesteryear, but it's being done behind your back. And you actually can't see it. You may feel something is off, but you never quite know. That's how AI-powered discrimination can work. You put that in the voting context, and you have what used to be white voters and black voters getting different notices, white voters getting an accurate notice, black voters being told election day is in the wrong day to try to throw people out the wrong week to throw people off, or different rules about early voting that aren't true. You get that power by AI, and the way people consume information these days is on devices. We pick up a device, we take a look, oh, this is the information. And it's hard to know what you can rely on or not. And what that ultimately leads to, I think, is one of the most compelling points that so many of the speakers made at the Insight Forum this morning, is that the ultimately leads to an erosion, not just of democracy, as Melanie said, but an erosion of trust, an erosion of confidence in information. And so that's so critical, because we and the other allies in this work spend so much time being those credible messengers that have direct contact with voters. Between the work that Melanie does and the Coalition and the Black Women's Roundtable do in communities, and the work that we do that supports that, and through the Election Protection Hotline, 866 Our Vote, and the other sister hotlines in other languages, we touch a lot of voters, a lot of folks who are targeted for disenfranchisement. And they may not always see the visible harms, but they feel it. They feel it when the voice isn't heard in electoral processes. They feel it when they're turned away from the polls. They feel it when they realize they've been had and been subjected to mis and disinformation. And we all feel it when people feel disaffected and disconnected and even decide not to vote at all. I think that is the aim of some of these folks. The fewer votes, the better, because it allows certain people to hold on to power.
I'll general what Damon has said, and the fact that it is about who codes these algorithms. And that is one of the things that we put in our recommendations, has to do with making sure that the actual communities that are impacted, that there's diversity in these companies and how they are addressing what they are building out for quote unquote public good. And being able to know how your privacy is being utilized. And as Damon pointed out, bringing that into the electoral process is even more, I don't want to say scary, but I'm going to say scary. Just This is put it plain. But not to scare folks into inaction, because the whole idea about this is that we can do something about it, and technology is pervasive in our lives from really from birth to death now. And so here we are in this moment, and it is a historical moment, right? It's not as easy to put your hands around, because we're talking about technology. You can't see behind that computer. You can't see behind that screen, but there are human beings who are manipulating that process. And so it's very important that also that voters who may listen to what we're saying today, to make sure they weigh in on this, and make sure that they find out where their congresspersons are on making sure that they're going to protect their rights when it comes to voting and this electoral process, and do everything that they can do. You won't solve all the problems in one legislative fix, but again, to not do anything would be opening up the door for us to see just an erosion of this whole process, and that we call this American experiment.
Well, thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Damon, for sharing your expertise and your experiences from this morning. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close down?
I want to say that I just want to underscore the amount of work and the smart and strategic work that the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation does, that our partners, including the coalition throughout the Election Protection Coalition, do. I'm on the ground to inform, to engage voters. Some do GOTV, some do what I call GOTM, get out the message, and not just to vote. No one should ever mistake that work and positive notes about Black voter turnout as meaning that we don't need regulation and legislation on AI, that we don't need a John Lewis Voter Rights Advancement Act, that we don't need civil rights protections. Because the challenges are age old. And here's the thing, they're not getting better, they're only getting worse. Just look at all of the voter suppression bills, not even just after the Shelby County decision, but in the last couple of years. Really since 2021. Look at the impact of AI on people just being confused about what's real and what's not. So let's not ever get confused that the effort and energy, even when it's successful and impactful, which it often is, from groups like Melanie's, are somehow a substitute or should somehow be the new normal. That is not normal. It shouldn't have to be normal. It shouldn't take that much effort just to ensure that somebody's vote is cast and that that vote is counted and remains counted, and that people have accurate information all along the way. That's not okay. We can do better as a nation. We can do better by all of our people.
I'd just say thank you for those who joined us today, and this work will continue.
Well, thank you so much. As a reminder to the media, if you have follow-up questions, you can feel free to email communications@ncbcp.org. This stream was also hosted on our media partners website, Roland Martin Live. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.